Good morning and welcome to Plymouth, Massachusetts. That's right, the Plymouth, Massachusetts, the very place where the Pilgrims, religious refugees from England and Europe, crossed the ocean after 66 days on the Mayflower, explored the coast for a little while, and eventually stepped ashore here to establish the first successful colony in New England, created complicated alliances with the local Native Americans who helped them survive the first couple of years here, teach them how to grow their crops, and according to legend, celebrated the first Thanksgiving. Now, obviously, with any piece of history or any country's foundational myths, the full truth is a little more complicated than that story, but we'll hopefully get to that a little bit later. The important thing for the moment is that this is the very shore where in 1620, those Pilgrims stepped onto land to establish their Plymouth colony, or Plymouth plantation as they would have called it then. And the very spot they stepped ashore, according to legend, according to myth, is right here. And under that stone canopy there is the foundation stone of American history and American legend, Plymouth Rock itself. The very stone upon which the Pilgrims stepped to make their first landing at their future colony. The actual rock that planted the seed for the future United States of America, which, if taken literally, is a huge piece of American history and a huge piece of world history, which makes it all the more incredible that the rock is so small looking. Would you look at the size of Plymouth Rock? And by look at the size, I mean look how itty bitty it looks. It looks positively tiny, like you could fit it in the back of a pickup truck. To say it looks more like a pet rock is a slight exaggeration, but only a slight one. But this is, in fact, the actual Plymouth Rock. Now, it may surprise most people to know that the earliest Pilgrims never mentioned Plymouth Rock. They never mentioned stepping ashore onto any rocks, and in fact, stepping straight off your landing boat onto a boulder seems like a pretty impractical way to get on shore. The real story is that it wasn't until 1741, 121 years after the Pilgrims' landing, that Plymouth Rock was identified by the son of one of the sort of original Pilgrims who actually landed here 2 years after the Mayflower, when he himself was well into his 90s. They were going to build wharves here, and they were actually going to destroy the rock, so he asked people to bring his frail body down here so that he could say farewell to the original Plymouth Rock where his forefathers landed. And ever since that point, particularly because his story made such a big impact on the local inhabitants and descendants of the original Pilgrims, the legend of Plymouth Rock, the original stone that the Pilgrims stepped ashore onto, started to grow and grow until every American school child would be able to tell you, where did the Pilgrims step ashore? Not at Plymouth, but at Plymouth Rock. Now, what we see today of Plymouth Rock is only about a third of the size of the boulder in 1620. So it was a very large and prominent rock here, and certainly, because this is the location of the original Plymouth Harbor, the Pilgrims most certainly did step on that rock. It sort of still gets a pass as an important cultural touchstone, even though the Pilgrims didn't technically land on the rock. And it has an absolutely fascinating history of its own, because after it was identified by that 94-year-old man, Thomas Fonts, rather than being destroyed to make way for their new waterfront, they actually tried to save Plymouth Rock by hauling it out of there into town square here, which is how a big chunk, the upper third of the original 20,000-pound boulder, was broken off, placed up higher in the town, and chipped away at by souvenir hunters until 1880, when this waterfront park and monument were created and the rocks were rejoined together. Now, when you see the rock today and you see that split in it, you think, oh, that's where the rock broke. But in fact, the rock broke horizontally underneath it. You're only seeing that top third of the rock that had broken off. The split that you see today and the repair are from the 1950s, when enough fresh water got into a natural crack that it froze, cracked Plymouth Rock, and it had to be sort of patched in there so fresh water couldn't get back inside and make it worse. So even what you're seeing in here now today is only a third of what's left, because 2/3 of the remaining parts of Plymouth Rock are connected to it again, but underneath the portion that you see up here with 1620 stamped on it. That's just what's left of the piece that went up to town square and got moved around and had other chunks chipped off of it. So many chunks, in fact, that nobody has an accurate count of how many pieces of Plymouth Rock are spread around the country in various town halls and churches. I mean, your grandma might have a little piece of Plymouth Rock in her attic for all we know. So if your first reaction, like mine was 20 years ago when I first set eyes on Plymouth Rock, why is it so small? Well, remember that it's 3 times bigger than what you can actually see, and it might have been 2 to 3 times bigger when it first sat here on the then sandy shore, where it was the only large natural boulder visible on the shoreline for a mile in either direction. So if you come here and you go, it's so tiny, you're right. But as you just heard, there's a fascinating story as to why, and it really makes you think, oh, this is why at so many historical sites they don't let you climb all over the rocks, because preservation, it turns out, is an important thing. Anyway, when I first laid eyes on Plymouth Rock, I'm not gonna lie, I laughed for about 5 minutes because I wasn't expecting it to be so small. How about you? What did you think yesterday when you first laid eyes on Plymouth Rock? Was it smaller than you expected?
It was bigger than I thought.
Bigger?
I just saw a picture of it somewhere and it looked like it was like this big.
Well, it's definitely not shoebox size. That's the first time I've ever heard anyone say, wow, it's bigger than I expected. But you know what? When I first came here, it was sort of before social media, before Wikipedia had pictures of it and all that kind of stuff. So I probably didn't have any clue what it looked like. I think I had only ever seen just like the surface of it with 1620 and the crack, you know? So I thought it was this huge thing that they anchored a boat against, and then I looked and I was very surprised that it was something that looks like you could haul it away in the back of a large pickup truck. Well, anyway, folks, there you go. The founding stone of American history, at least the version of American history that's become enshrined in our common cultural myths, Plymouth Rock. But of course, Plymouth Rock isn't all that there is to Plymouth, Massachusetts, and the Pilgrims and the Thanksgiving story, because once they stepped ashore onto Plymouth Rock, the early Pilgrims had to build themselves shelter, had to find themselves food, and of course had to face that wide open wilderness that was already inhabited, and make contact and alliances with those people and their leader, Massasoit. And the stories from that early settlement are fascinating, they are richly detailed, and all of the legendary stories and events of the Plymouth colony happened just within yards of where we are standing over here, including that 3-day celebration with Massasoit and his men that would come to represent the first Thanksgiving. But of course, the Plymouth of the 2020s looks a lot different than the Plymouth of the 1620s. 400 years will do that to the place. I mean, look at these condominiums. Those weren't here when the Pilgrims stepped ashore. But luckily, there is a place nearby where we can see what life was like for those early Pilgrims, and that's where we're headed next. This is Plymouth Patuxet, formerly known as Plymouth Plantation, a recreation of 17th century Plymouth. Specifically, I believe, in this recreation, it's supposed to be 1627, and this is truly incredible. It gives you an idea how those early Pilgrims lived here on the shores of Cape Cod, within the walls of their palisade, of course, protected by their little fort with their cannons up there that we'll see in a minute. Look at this. Look at the wooden buildings with the rough hewn planks, the thatched roofs, the little gardens. I have always wanted to come out here. Now, I believe in November, rather than it being 1627, they celebrate the year 1621, when that feast with Massasoit, the first Thanksgiving as we think of it, took place. This is incredible. And this little village here is full of reenactors wearing Pilgrim-style clothing. I cannot wait to check this out. Patuxet, by the way, was the Native American name for this part of the area. They're trying to be a little bit more inclusive in their terminology these days, which isn't a bad thing. And speaking of not a bad thing, look at this place. Look at this recreated Pilgrim's house. You would have had all kinds of items in here. Items brought over from England on the Mayflower or later ships. You would have had things that were hand-built by the Pilgrims in Plymouth. This is incredible. Look, Allie, look at the herbs hanging up to dry over the fireplace. And I love seeing the wooden shutters, because of course there probably wasn't a lot of room on the Mayflower for window glass. This is awesome. I hear a Pilgrim lady in the next house. Let's go check it out. This is so exciting. I can't get over the roofs. Wow, look at that. Oof, you gotta watch your head in these Pilgrim houses. They're all alley size. All right, It smells so good in here because something's cooking.
Yeah, so in England there are men whose entire trade is to make this sort of thing, so one might inherit or buy. But we brought our whole households with us here. Though there are some of us who have married here, and so we have not the sort of the household already set up. So we make do, but you know, you can put a napkin over a barrel and you can eat on that if necessary. It's true. As long as you put a napkin on it, it's fine. This is a curd, a Lombardy tart, which has some of that hard cheese in it. You can see a little curd there. Oh, it's all mixed through. Curds being soft cheese.
I've never had curd loaf before.
Oh yeah, you know how to make curds?
No.
No? Well, if you make curds, so that's a whole other thing. Soft cheese, or you've got soft cheese, you add in flour and a couple eggs and spices.
Oh, wow.
Ginger and nutmeg, cinnamon. Oh, did you see the heifers?
No.
We do have cattle, but we have very few cows.
This is amazing. These chimneys are all built out of mud?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of looks like mud. It's clay mixture.
Wow.
It's called daub. So yeah, we mix it all together.
So the sticks are the wattle, and it's wattle and daub?
Exactly. Wattle and daub. Yeah.
Oh, wattle and daub.
Yeah.
That was awesome. She said she hopes we come to live and settle here. That would be Allie's dream. Settling in New England, waiting for the fall colors. It's amazing to watch them making the food like that. Look at this. Now, speaking of settlers, the first one of my ancestors in America, well, first direct father to son ancestor, got here in 1640, landed in Massachusetts, and then went down to New Amsterdam, today's New York. The crazy part is, he didn't live much differently when he set up his first farm on Long Island than the Pilgrims would have lived here. So this is crazy. Plus, there were Pilgrims named Warren, and you're named Warren. You might be a Pilgrim descendant. Allie loves that they hang up their chairs. I'm just tripping out on the dirt floors. Of course, if you lived in a house like this, the dirt would get packed down. I mean, really hard, to the point that you could actually sweep a dirt floor if you lived in a house like this. Some of them, like that first house we went into, had like a wooden floor, a puncheon floor, like split logs. This really trips me out. The stick and clay, or wattle and daub chimneys in here, and you have all your sparks and everything flying up. Imagine, though, your thatched roof, your wooden house, there could have very easily been accidents if you weren't careful with fire. Oh, look at this. Look at some of their documents out here. They're very early printed material. Some of the Pilgrims, or those reformed Puritan people, are their printed documents here. Actually, early printed documents printed by sort of the religious rebels that made up a chunk of the Pilgrims, are part of what was getting them in trouble in Holland. See, the Pilgrims, the actual religious Pilgrims, they didn't want to be part of the Church of England. Well, they wanted to reform the Church of England from within, and when they couldn't do that, they settled in Holland for a while, but they would print material and send it over to England. That would get them in all kinds of trouble, and eventually made the bargain that would get them out of the king's hair and off to the New World here at Plymouth, where they were free from the king's reign, they were free from the Church of England, but they were also here with settlers that believed in different forms of Christian religion, and, of course, maybe no religion at all. And that led to the Pilgrims drawing up the Mayflower Compact, an early written document where they had to live by written laws and pre-established rules that were influenced by those religious reformers who believed that you would vote and the greater part agreeing on something together was God's will. You sort of had the earliest form of democracy here in the New World, where people could live with different religious creeds under one sort of somewhat secular, overarching kind of democratic-ish government. And that is why, as Americans, we chose Plymouth as our sort of founding myth, rather than Jamestown, Virginia, which was very much under the heel of the King of England. And, of course, after the Civil War, the victorious North wasn't exactly going to pay homage to the earlier Jamestown settlement, which was in the South, one, and two, the Jamestown colony was abandoned for a while, so Plymouth is the oldest continuously inhabited English settlement in what would become the United States of America. Let's check out some more buildings. Look at this place. It is absolutely gorgeous today. I understand there are more Pilgrims here on the weekends, but this is still pretty cool, particularly because I'm sort of a self-guided guy, you know what I mean? I like guided tours, okay, but I also like exploring and checking things out for myself. Look at this, here's one of those wooden floors I was talking about. And there, look at that covered bed. That would be very handy in the wintertime out here. You know it would be cold with that ocean breeze blowing in. Look at the Pilgrim shoe. That looks like it would fit you. It definitely wouldn't have fit me. I barely fit in most of these houses. They have really low ceilings. I'm too big to be a pilgrim. Not you though, Allie Roo. You are pilgrim-sized. Oh, look at those cauldrons right there. Maybe some of these pilgrims were witches. No, that's not fair. Every house had a cauldron back then. You had to boil water and make soup somehow. I love this little three-legged stool. Now, one of these reenactors was telling us about how they had to bring their whole entire household over from England. You just think about that. Think about all the luggage you'd have to bring. Particularly in 1620, having no idea what kind of environment you were going to be in, what you would really need. And of course, you could really only bring the bare essentials. I'm not kidding about how beautiful this place is. Look at this. Gorgeous. Terrifying though when you get here and you realize that all your English crops aren't gonna grow in Massachusetts. Famously, of course, the Pilgrims had to quote unquote borrow some stored corn from a spot where the natives had stashed it for the winter to survive here. And later, when some of their new neighbors figured that out, they had to pay it back to avoid trouble. But it was Massasoit and the Wampanoag people around here that really helped the Pilgrims to survive, showing them how to plant the native crops and how to harvest them. And obviously, famously, Massasoit used the interpreter Squantum, or Squanto as he was nicknamed, to help interpret between the indigenous Americans and the new settlers, to protect them and to warn them if there were any other hostile natives around. Plus, teach them, of course, how to sow and reap those indigenous crops. Uh-oh, the village isn't gonna be peaceful for long. Looks like some new settlers are coming. Must have taken a couple of boatloads to bring all of them, yikes. Wow, we better hurry into some more of these houses before they fill up with new settlers. Actually, that is a thing that did happen after the first round of people got here on the Mayflower. The sponsors of the venture back in England kept sending more and more settlers here, but without sending more supplies. So of course the limited amount of food that the settlers had kept on getting more and more and more limited. In fact, there was a point at which they even had to very delicately ask Massasoit, can you keep even your people away? You guys keep coming into the village and we want to treat you nicely and share all our food, but we don't have enough to go around. So things were really, really tight in the early years, and I cannot emphasize enough how much it is true that the Pilgrims would have never survived without the grace and mercy and patronage of Massasoit. They didn't have much food here, and there were all kinds of different tribes and different groups in the area who didn't want the settlers to stay here. They really could have been massacred many times over, multiple times. And of course, had the natives known that this small group of settlers would lead to thousands upon thousands, and eventually millions and millions of European immigrants and other immigrants from all over the world taking over this land, they probably would have not been so welcoming. Let's put it that way. I wouldn't have been anyway. A lot of apparently field trip groups here learning from the reenactors. I would show you what they're saying, but they're mostly doing stuff like asking her for her number and making jokes. Too many teens and not enough chaperones today.
I am a lusty lad.
I mean, I could bench 135, so.
I am known for my might and my main.
Boy, dude, when it took burning wood to keep warm, it took a lot of sawing and chopping and breaking and splitting and manual labor just to stay alive. Look at this guy. Look at his breeches.
Alright.
That's a clean cut.
You, what is your name, lad?
Me?
Yeah,
Charles.
Charles. Ah, like our king.
Yeah,
Charles
King
the
Charles,
best.
yeah.
Dude, these guys are great. They're working hard with these kids. He's talking to them about oranges and how there's something for only the very rich and the rare. Talking about Robin Hood. They think quick. They're on their feet. And they're letting these kids play with saws, which is awesome. Meanwhile, over here, Allie has found herself a couple of friends. Look at this goat and look at that different kind of kid right there. Aw, see, look at this. Allie's like a real-life Disney princess. All the animals come out for her and do the laundry. Hi, have you seen any witches here? No, not witches. They burn those. Yeah, see, when you roll into downtown Plymouth, you're like, oh, this isn't really what I was picturing. This over here at Plymouth Patuxet, this is what you picture when you think of the first Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims, although I gotta be honest with you, I was expecting more buckles on shoes and fewer goats. I mean, maybe some goats, just fewer of them. Now, speaking of the first Thanksgiving, in the time of the English colonists, they had many feasts of Thanksgiving for births, baptisms, christenings, founding a new church building maybe, to celebrate anything they sort of saw as a great act of providence, but especially, of course, at harvest time where they had so much to be thankful for. Number one, food. Number two, that the good Lord had blessed them with a good harvest. And number three, that they were getting along with the neighbors here in 1621 when they had their first harvest, when Massasoit, who was basically the big leader in the area, and about 90 of his followers turned up with some deer meat, and along with the fruits of the English settlers' first harvest, and possibly some local native wild turkey, they had basically a 3-day celebration of their good fortune. Now let's head back inside and see Allie's new friend.
It's Goodwin Stephen Hopkins, his host. I do assist Goodwin Hopkins a great deal, so oftentimes I'm in their house.
Is it a long time to make it? To build it?
Well, this house in particular, methinks it was 1 or 2 minutes. As the Hopkins family, they did sail here on the ship called the Mayflower. So they were amongst the first to come to this place, whereas the rest of my family, when our house was built, it takes them 3 or 4 minutes, because my father did not have a house built by the time we had arrived in 1623. And so we do live outside the palisade, and it did take longer as it was not nearly as dire, I suppose, to build a house. Is it much like your house?
No, not even close.
No?
No.
Truly? What makes it different?
We have different walls, different windows.
Yeah, I did as well back in England. I do miss having glass on the windows.
Oh,
This way the insects can just come in. However, when the insects do come in, I do catch them. And I do put them in my sister's pillow.
That's funny.
She does not like it, but I think it's quite good.
Oh, Allie, you made a new friend.
Yeah, she was so nice. She gave me this rock.
What'd she say?
She said I was beautiful and that it fits me.
Aw, now you have a new BFF. Too bad she doesn't have a cell phone, so she won't be able to keep in contact very easily. Plus, I don't think the postal service exists yet, so I don't even know how long it takes to get a letter over here. I mentioned Massasoit several times, and the Wampanoag people down here, and it should be said that as much as we appreciate Thanksgiving and the food, and there's a lot to celebrate at Thanksgiving, including the fact that, you know, Abraham Lincoln sort of set that up as a way of Americans to get together and give thanks for their many blessings and the Civil War ending. And there's a lot to celebrate with the Pilgrims, because after all, many people can trace their ancestry back all the way even to the Mayflower and some of these early colonies, and we can appreciate how hard they worked to survive. We can appreciate the Mayflower Compact and the way that they voted together and lived in harmony with each other, even though they had differing religious beliefs in the very first Plymouth settlement, and even the way that they made treaties with their neighbors and got along with the indigenous Americans nearby. At first, still it must be said that not everybody remembers the first Thanksgiving or the landing of the Pilgrims as a particularly good thing, and I would be talking about the native point of view. Really, the only reason that the Pilgrims were able to settle in Patuxet is there was sort of a hole in the native population where European diseases from fishing boats and traders who had visited this area of Massachusetts had pretty much decimated and wiped out whole groups of people. You remember Squanto that we were talking about? His whole village was wiped out. He himself had been kidnapped by Europeans, taken to Spain as a slave, and then we don't know exactly how, but eventually got to England, made his way back to the New World, and that's how he knew English and was able to interpret for all the Pilgrims. And part of why he settled here with them and stayed with them so long is because all of his people from the area were wiped out and gone. And Massasoit, who was sort of the great sachem or chief or leader in the area, he wanted the Pilgrims here, partially based on the fact that Squanto had told him about their superior weaponry, about the technological advantages they would bring with them, you know, metal tools and things like that, but also because they had rival groups in the area, and having a hole in your land where there weren't any people having been wiped out by disease, like I said already, was a big time strategic disadvantage. So you can either have blank land and no buffer with your enemies in the area, or you could have the English settlers come here, fill the gap, sign a treaty with you, and help you protect your land against other groups, which is exactly what they were doing out here. As a matter of fact, between Massasoit and William Bradford and the other Pilgrims, there was peace for about 50 years, more or less, before the arrival of more and more colonists, plus the death of Massasoit and subsequent leadership of his heirs and further misunderstandings led to the outbreak of war and conflict and made the whole history of interaction between the English settlers or European settlers and the natives much, much more complicated and grisly. But those first few years really were a story of coming together of completely different cultures for mutual protection, and of course, without the natives, the Pilgrims would have never survived, so a lot of humanity on exhibit there. The story we hear as kids is, well, the Pilgrims stepped off onto Plymouth Rock, the natives met them with joy, they became best friends and celebrated Thanksgiving and got along forever. And then of course you have the very justifiable pushback on that no, these settlers came from an alien land, they came here and took land away from natives, they brought disease, pestilence, they broke their treaties, they ruined the perfect peaceful life of the natives. But then ultimately, when you do enough research, you kind of come to a more nuanced understanding and realize that it's complicated. There's both a lot to look up to and appreciate about the time period, and a lot to be sorrowful for, and really a lot to learn. I often wondered when I was younger, like, what was in it for the natives when the Pilgrims came? And it wasn't just that depopulation thing, but the technology thing. I mean, let's say during the pandemic, a whole chunk of California's population had been wiped out, and then a ship from outer space containing aliens with vastly different technology and a different language, you know. They look like us, they sound like us, but this group of aliens from outer space lands, and they want to settle there. We'd be like, well, you know, no one's living there now. It might be advantageous. They can live there, they can fill in the gap, and not only that, we can take advantage of their advanced technology, advanced weapons, advanced farming tools. I mean, a metal axe in 1620s America was nothing to sneer at. That's what was in it for Massasoit. That's exactly how he would have seen them. Like, these aliens, we're pretty sure they're human, but they're from some other place. They bring this technology, they've got all this different stuff. We could take advantage of this. He had no way of knowing that more and more and more ships would arrive with more and more and more people. Like I said earlier, I could only imagine that it would have significantly changed the math. Look at this, it looks like they have a cornfield down here. They would have called that Indian corn, or we would probably call it maize. It's one of the key ingredients to the Pilgrims' survival over here. It was dried corn out on Cape Cod where they first landed that they took from Indian storage areas that helped them survive that first winter and be able to plant crops in the following spring. And they're just lucky that they didn't end up landing in an even more northerly direction, because this is pretty far north, even for corn. And farther north at that time, the natives wouldn't have had agriculture at all. It would have just been, you know, sort of subsistence living off the land kind of a thing. It was very lucky for the Pilgrims, or providential as they would have said, that they came to an area where there was agriculture, and the natives had been growing surpluses to their crops, not just for trading amongst each other, but also with Europeans that were coming up and down the coast. Like I said, there's a lot of nuance, a lot of little pieces that came together to ensure their survival here, unlike at Jamestown. And if you have the time this fall or this winter, I highly recommend picking up a book about those early years. There's been so much more research in the modern era, and not just about the Pilgrims, but so much that's been uncovered about the Native Americans of that time. We just know a lot more about both sets of peoples now than we did for all those decades, where we learned that the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, met Squanto, and then immediately busted out the cranberry sauce, you know what I mean? We know a lot more nowadays, and it is fascinating stuff.
How many more years do you plan on staying here?
I'm rather set here.
Are you?
We're in a contract.
But it's only a 7-year contract.
Oh, well, even when the contract is done, this is being renegotiated by our agents, Master Allerton. I am going to remain rather close to this place. I'm simply going to be building a much more handsome house on the land that I've been promised a few miles away.
You have a wife? Children?
Nay.
Any prospects?
Are you
here?
married?
I'm divorced.
So you are looking for a husband?
I don't know that these quarters would, fit my style.
It's all right. These conditions, lass, are crude and barbarous in this place.
Dude, I could stand out here and listen to these reenactors all day long. They are fantastic. But the day groweth long, or the shadows groweth long, ye lords and ladies, and we depart by ship of the air on whence tomorrow doth come. So as much as I genuinely love this place, I mean, I waited to come here for 20 years since my first visit to Plymouth, since we're flying home to California in the morning and the day is getting long. We'd probably better make our way out of the 17th century English village and back towards the car, because there's other stuff to see in Plymouth, and most particularly that replica of the Mayflower that you may have noticed at the beginning of our adventure. We don't have much time left, but I have got to get on board before that closes. Hallie looks like she belongs here. You cute little pilgrim. Now, of course, the early settlers did have to build palisades and forts for protection whenever there were threats of, enemy ships or unfriendly neighbors who weren't part of their treaty with Massasoit. So they've got the fort over here at Plymouth Patuxet and several old school cannons, but the real main attraction of the fort is the money shot you get from up here on the second floor. Look at that. Gorgeous. But anyway, we've been referencing the indigenous inhabitants of the neighborhood, and they are not forgotten here at the museums. This is a replica of a winter house, and there are several sort of native structures here. This one is under a little bit of renovation. I don't think they had an aluminum ladder back in 1627, but that's okay because there's more at the historic Patuxet home site, which is down in this beautiful forest here. This all represents one single Wampanoag family's summer home site. So you have their cooking arbor, kind of away from where they would sleep, of course, because of fire. You have their little fields where they grew corn and squash. You could see all the different types of food that they ate. Unfortunately, they were just explaining to us that their summer house that would normally be covered with like cattail reeds, well, it takes a lot of reeds and they only last one season, and they are endangered in Massachusetts now, apparently. So they show you the basic internal construction. We've got to make do with a photograph of what it would look like if those reeds were all over it. Pretty cool. And then, of course, right over here is the winter house, which would have been located farther inland in the trees, away from the ocean breeze and the freezing cold temperatures. And this looks gorgeous out here. And this one is fully furnished. This is actually a small scale version because back then you would have had 40 to 60 people living in one of these during the winter. I really wish we had more time to check all of this out, but unfortunately we have got to go now, or we are going to miss our boat, which would be fine, except we already paid for it. I love that the packing meter zone is 1620 for Plymouth Rock. How sick is that? Now, each of these locations that we're going to obviously could have its own very long episode. And there are so many other sites here, like the old burying ground, and some of the oldest houses in the country are here in Plymouth, including one of the original Pilgrims houses. There are, as you can imagine, ghost tours in this town. One thing that's not here anymore is the wax museum that used to be on top of the hill by Plymouth Rock I always wanted to go to. Sadly now I'll never get a chance. Hey, buckle shoes, finally! But one thing I am finally going to be able to do is step aboard the Mayflower, or should I say, the Mayflower II, a full-scale reproduction of the original Mayflower. This one built in the 1950s that you can actually climb aboard and explore. With a ticket, of course. And that is our last destination of the day. There's a lot of historical information and some activities out here you can do before getting aboard the ship. But come on, nobody wants to do that. We want to climb aboard, matey. We're reverse pilgriming today, stepping off of Plymouth Rock and on to the Mayflower. Hopefully they don't take us all the way to England. All right, we start below decks. Oh my gosh. Look at this. 102 people were on board the Mayflower. 102 people had to sleep on this deck in hammocks. I hope they weren't tall people because this is a low ceiling. Imagine how many people hit their head in here while this boat was swaying across the waves. They famously had terrible weather on the crossing, which I believe took 66 days. Just rocking and and swaying, bumping into your neighbor as you ride in your hammock, and all your worldly possessions are all stored below decks down in the bottom of the ship. And there's nothing but timbers, a little bit of caulking, and the prayers of the Pilgrims between you and the ocean. And you either would have had a very sore back or a very strong back after 66 days of bending down here. And the main thing is, when there was bad weather or cold weather and you wanted to stay below, it would have been very dark down here. There weren't electric lights in the passenger quarters, and I can't imagine they would have passed around too many fire-burning lanterns down here for people to hold. This is crazy. I wish I knew more about sailing ships, even sailboats I don't know much about. Just what little I've learned on the sailing ship Columbia at Disneyland. But I do know this. It must have been a very uncomfortable, long, and stressful journey. It must have been a lot of anxiety, huh, Allie? When you're thinking, are we going to drown today?
Right.
Only one person died on the way over from England, I believe, which at that time was considered a miracle. But you gotta remember, back then, in the 1600s, people were getting scurvy left and right on these kind of voyages. Pestilences, plagues, being tossed overboard. Drowning, you could have had mutinies, there could have been all kinds of problems. They're lucky they just had a little rough weather and a late start in the new world. Because being in one of these ships and feeling as claustrophobic as I do from just being down here for 15 minutes, you think, man, 66 days. I must begrudgingly admit, that's worse than the flight I took to get here. Oh, I always thought I might like it on a ship like this, but it is claustrophobic down there. I'd probably want to be up here, getting in the sailor's way and getting yelled at. At least up here you can stretch out. Gosh, it would have been a heck of a lot of work to work on one of these ships, to be a crew member, back breaking labor, swabbing the decks, shooting these little deck cannons. What are these, harpoon guns? Like I said, I'm pretty ignorant when it comes to sailing ships. Epic. Way more impressive than the Columbia. Dude, look how high that mast is. In the movies, it always looked like so much fun when I was a kid to climb up into the crow's nest. I'll tell you what, in real life, looking up along those ropes, that is a lot higher than I thought it was off the deck. Ooh, sort of gut-wrenching. Ooh, look at this. We got some more cabins or interior spaces on the ship to check out. Oh my gosh, this is how they steered the ship. And they couldn't see from in here, so they're just doing it with a compass and charts, flying blind. It's incredible. Yeah, a little bit of crew quarters up there, but look back here in the rear cabin. Look at the space back here. This must be the captain's table or the shipmaster's table. Look at these little cubbies, man. Those are alley-sized little cubbies. I would be pretty cramped if I tried to sleep in there. And that's probably a lot more comfortable than the hammocks down below for the Pilgrims. Yarr, where be Captain Jack Sparrow? That's all I can think about, even though Captain Jack Sparrow wasn't even a twinkle in his father's eye when the Pilgrims were crossing on the Mayflower. I love how everything has storage in it. This high bench at the back. There's all these foot lockers. And look at the view out of this window in the back of the ship. That's amazing. There's really not very many windows at all on the Mayflower, I've noticed. For one thing, I guess you wouldn't want many spots where the waves could break the glass and water could come in your boat. You'd think they'd want light, but maybe when you're in the middle of the ocean looking out the window is depressing because you're going to see the same thing every day over and over again for 66 days. And that's nothing compared to the voyages of, say, Captain Cook and his men that went around the world and spent years out at sea. Wild. This is incredible, you guys. Look it. Ma, look, I'm on the Mayflower. I'm making my way to America so I can believe in whatever religion I want and settle new lands and make new friends and potentially accidentally displace a lot of people. It's very interesting because I get all enthusiastic about the Pilgrims and then, you know, sort of the more modern takes on those old historical situations come into my brain, and I guess we're living in an interesting time in history where looking at history changes all the time. But you know what hasn't changed? There were children on this boat, and you can tell that because they've got wooden spoons to take care of them. You know. Do you know about the wooden spoon? I know all about the wooden spoon. And the yardstick. My grandma used a yardstick. Suddenly my rump stings. Alright, this is awesome. I wasn't expecting a rudder like that. I thought I was going to see a big old pirate-style style wheel. But I guess the Pilgrims like to keep it simple. Wow, this is amazing. We got one more deck to visit up top. I'm not super familiar with all the nautical terminology. Is this the poop deck? I don't feel anything in my stomach. I did just learn that that rudder is called a whipstaff. That's pretty interesting. Now look at this. This is amazing. It doesn't have that big wheel like I was expecting. This is incredible. So much rope. So many ropes, so much rigging, so many knots and cleats to tie things around. Just seems pretty darn complicated sailing. And although I'd love to ride on a sailboat and watch other people do it, I've never had any desire to learn because it looks like a lot of work. All right, there's one last little cabin up here on top in the very back of the Mayflower II. Doesn't appear to be much in it except for this little bed here. So I'm assuming this must be the captain's quarters. And look at this, look at all the modern gadgets in here for modern sailing. That's right, the Mayflower II is seaworthy, which means theoretically, I guess you really could reverse Pilgrim and take this bad boy all the way back to England. Hopefully it would take less time than in the past. And hopefully they'd give you better food because hardtack and salt pork doesn't sound very appetizing, particularly when your boat's rocking around. Now all I can think about is my song that I did for that Disneyland video. Yar it be me, the chicken of the sea. Speaking of rocking, it's time for us to rock and roll our way off of the Mayflower. This has been a pretty cool experience though. Just climbing aboard and seeing it. Again, each one of these locations could have been its own full-length episode. There's so much to learn, to know, to discover out here at Plymouth. And coming to locations like this is great because it inspires you, or at least it does me, to go home, to learn more. And that, in turn, always makes me want to come back and check out places again and again. Find more stories, uncover more history. And you know what? The Mayflower II in particular, I just really don't want to leave.
Why? Because of the history?
No, the history is cool. The reason I don't want to leave is the exit. Would you look at the size of that drop? That is a lot farther down and a lot ricketier than it looks like it is. Oh, I am actually so scared and actually so nervous right now. When I came up here, nobody warned me I was gonna have to walk the plank. Okay. Oh, what are you laughing at? It's not funny. No, don't leave me. I'm coming. I hate this. I hate this so much. Big steps. Okay, I'm over the pier. I'm a little safer. Thank God for handrails. Oh, it is high up there. Now I know why walking the plank was such a big punishment. If I had to get punished on board a ship, I'd way rather have the boo box. The boo box! All right, gang, there's so much more to do. So much more to see in Plymouth. But that's all we have time for today. We came out to the East Coast. We visited Salem, Massachusetts. So in addition to this rich history, we got a little witch history earlier this week. We went leaf peeping up in New Hampshire and Vermont. We visited Haunted Overload, maybe the best Halloween/haunted house attraction in the United States. And then came out here to Plymouth, saw Plymouth Rock, Plymouth Plantation, and the Mayflower II, where it all began. But that's all we have time for because this was a very short, very low budget trip just to bring you to New England. Allie, did you like it? Did you have fun?
Yes, I loved it.
It backfired on me because now you really wish you lived out here, huh?
Yes.
Especially in the fall colors. I'm sure you wouldn't like the winter, but the fall is, I must grant you, very beautiful out here. Now, my friends, we're gonna go have a little bit of a tea party because we're heading to Boston in the morning to fly home. But you can help ensure our future return and support future adventures by signing up at our Patreon or checking out our online store in the links below. And now that we've seen and done everything we could in New England in a week, we've done our duty. Time for us to go home and sleep well. been sailing for 66 days, and I've been looking for Plymouth Rock. Is this it? No. Is this one? No. At last, after all this time, I found it. Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock. I found Plymouth Rock, everyone. Plymouth Rock, the real Plymouth Rock. Oh, it was worth the whole trip, I tell ya. We're gonna have a feast. Invite everyone. It's time for a Thanksgiving. And at last, finally, me and my bride can wed because I got you a wedding present, darling. Look at the rock I'm putting on your finger. It's Plymouth Rock. We got a whole continent to explore. First, I gotta build a house, but it won't have a floor. It'll be dirt. And there'll be mice. Just don't be getting into any witchcraft. They wouldn't like that up in Salem town, I'll tell you. Oh, why am I talking Irish? Great Scott, I should have been talking like this. Oh, Plymouth, man. What a town. Man, a lot of fun and hijinks going on and zany stuff to do. All right, I gotta admit, it's pretty dead around here. Oh my gosh, that's one of the Pilgrims' original helicopters!
I've been here just over 4 years myself. Oh, well, thanks. I'd prefer to go back in London. Well, this place is horrible. Don't you agree? Yeah. Do you know what lives in these woods? Bears, wolves, lions of the Africas.
That's scary.
And there are fairies as well. Be very careful.
That's cool.
Oh no, they are meddlesome creatures. They will steal your breath and pinch you till you are black and blue.
Oh no.
See how it comes out like this?
Oh yeah, okay.
And what you are to do is bring the 2 pieces into the back like that. And pull it tight.
Oh, okay. No, mine's a little different.
That's alright if you can't do it that way. And then what you are to do is simply, to do it properly, you would tie it in a bow. And then you would tuck up all of the excess.
Oh, okay.
And you would not care for anyone to see it. It would make you look sluggardly.
Mine's a little pointy.
It's alright.
This goes on the back like this,
And
and then
then
around the back. Oh, okay.
Well
I was
done!
tying it in the front, and I was like, this doesn't seem right.
Now that would be more like onto a bonnet.
Yeah.
And these, so coifs, we do wear them to have our hair covered, as you would care to have your hair covered before God. But the only times you would not wear your coif is if you're in your own home and you're laboring around the house. Mayhap your hair would still be up in braids, and there are sundry different ways you can put your hair up in the braids.
Okay.
And also, the only other time you might not wear your coif, you know what that is? When you're being married!
Aww.
Oh, so you might have your hair done like you do, but it would be adorned with flowers.
Whoa. Hip hop.
Joan!
Why would I want a stone?
I don't know, you always have them.
Well, yeah, but I can just pick them up. Why do I want yours?
Because it's from me.
What is it?
I don't know.
Check it out. It's the Mayflower. Look at my breeches.
It be original Plymouth Rock mouse. It be ye original Plymouth Pilgrim mouse. He's running around in the original Pilgrim house. Doot doot doot. It's the original Pilgrim Rock mouse of the house. The Pilgrim Rock mouse of the house. It's the original Pilgrim.